Okay, live again, I think. Yeah, just quickly share this on the page. Sorry, on the group. This bit always takes too long. See, this is when I do the YouTube videos, I just edit all this out. I can't do it live. Okay, all set. Right, so this is session 2, Q&A session 2, where we're going to be talking about a lot of the questions that came in after the second video that came out, which is all around tackling corner entry confidence. Again, we've got some questions lined up that we're going to tackle first, but if you jump in live and you do have some questions, then feel free to just pop them in the chat and I'll get to those when I can. Again, if you have no idea what we're talking about, then we're right in the middle of a free workshop, Road to High Level Riding, which you should be able to find a link above this video to join that if you want to. And we're going to have one more video coming out tomorrow and another session on Saturday where you can get your questions answered. Okay, morning Chris, good to see you. Righty-ho. Marche, and you? Got your questions lined up? Right. Let's tweak this a bit. Okay, we'll jump in with the first question, which came from Neil. He said, my problem is with lean angle. My inbuilt leanometer seems to naturally take me over to the same lean angle every single time. So my question is, do I simply apply more pressure to the inside bar and force it to lean more? So I picked this one because this is going to be an answer for a lot of riders in this. And it's not just about lean angle, it's about any situation where you're kind of having to force yourself past your own beliefs and your own barriers around what the bike can do and what the tires can do. So to answer the question, yes, on a very, very basic level, if you continue pushing the inside bar, the bike is going to continue leaning over. But if you don't have a proper plan to tackle that, you don't understand what's safe to do, and you don't believe that it's safe to go to that point, and you don't have the mental space to actually deal with that, what do you think is going to happen? You're going to find the exact same result that you've been getting over and over again and just going to that same lean angle. So there can be a fair few things to this, and I've written out some points just to make sure I hit the notes here because I want this to be as helpful as possible. The first is that more speed is necessary. So the damage is done almost before you've even got to the corner, because most people will overbrake. And if you overbrake and go down to the same speed that you went in previously, you're not going to use more lean angle because you don't need to. And assuming that you're hitting the apex okay, and you're creating a somewhat decent line, when you go into that corner with the same amount of speed, if you try and lean the bike more, you're going to meet the inside of the track too soon. So that's the first thing. Like, you have to build the confidence to actually take that speed in, which again comes with a few things I'm about to talk about. The other thing is that there's no quick fix to this. I really wish there was, because it was a massive issue for me for a long time, and I see it with so many different riders. And like I said in the last live, there are riders, really annoying riders, that come along and they can just smash past these barriers without even thinking about it. They haven't spent any time learning about the sport or what's right for the bike. They can just go out there and do it. And yeah, most people are not like that. But, and this isn't a criticism, but what you'll find with those riders is they will also crash more often because they're just flying towards the limits of grip without really knowing what they should be doing. Now, they might get past those and reach a really good lap time, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're riding well. So yeah, again, for most people, this is not a quick fix. This is going to take time. One of the biggest things you can do is to try and take an assessment of what you're currently doing. So, and a lot of that comes from knowing what's correct. So yeah, so do you know what you should be doing? Do you know what's safe to be doing with the steering, with the brakes, where you need to be hitting your spots in this particular corner? Because if you don't know those things, it's going to be really hard to push past that barrier because you're just flying into an unknown situation and you don't know what result you're going to get. But when you start to really learn about the sport and you really understand what the bike wants and how to give the bike what it wants, and to be hitting these things on a fundamental level really well, that kind of stuff is going to start to build confidence in what you're doing. So instead of having confidence in the tires, you have confidence in yourself, because you can say to yourself, okay, I'm performing these fundamental techniques to a T, so surely if I go to that new level, I should be fine, because I can see people doing it. I'm told the tires should do it. The bike is easily capable. You know these things. So if my technique is right, then surely I can go there and it shouldn't be a problem. And if the bike isn't showing any signs of issues already, then that in itself, again, that's not going to be the only thing that will get you over that barrier, but that's going to be one of the big things, is knowing exactly what you should be doing and be able to execute that. Because from that point you can say, okay, I'm doing the right things, then surely it must be safe to go a bit further. So yeah, once you gain that understanding and you can display that level of control, then that's going to start to build that confidence. The other thing I talk a lot about is gaining perspective, which is something I just touched on, but looking at other things around you and other people and in similar situations, and really taking from that it's okay to do this stuff. So one of my biggest breakthroughs in this came from literally just watching my friends go racing. So I was there on, I think it was on a Friday, and I was riding on the track on the Saturday. And just seeing those guys flying around on similar machinery and tyres, just overnight, it just unlocked something in me, and I went a few seconds quicker the very next day, adding more lean angle everywhere, because I just had this new belief in what the bike could do. Now, that is getting the perspective, because I saw those people riding and I was just thinking, well, they're doing it and it looks so easy, so surely I can do it. Again, falling back on the notion that I knew what I was doing from a fundamentals point of view. So that's a big thing, is really figuring out and taking a look at the true potential of your bike and tyre combination, and that in itself could be a trigger for you to really push past those things. And then the final piece is just putting yourself in the position to actually make the step. So, like I said at the beginning, if you're not running more speed into the corner, then you're just not going to lean the bike more, because you won't need to. So it's about putting yourself in a position to incrementally do that in a safe way, so you can actually push past that barrier. And again, that talks a lot of that touches on a lot of the stuff that was in video 1, where we talked about setting the plan and leaving yourself the brain space to do that. Because if you're just charging into corners and just not really thinking about anything, again, you're going to get the same result over and over again, because you're just not thinking about that stuff, and you're gonna bump up against the same habits and the same barriers you had before. So yeah, the final piece there is putting yourself in the position to actually push through by giving yourself the attention to do it. And then from that point, it really just comes from once you've reached even just a half decent level in the braking zone in terms of how much you're using the brakes. All it takes from that point on is just releasing that brake lever a bit quicker, just so you're taking 2 or 3 miles an hour more into the corner. And from that point, you just, like, this is what I used to do. I used to do that, and then I would tell myself, because sometimes you'll get into the corner and you'll hit that same barrier again. But then this is why I recommend doing this on longer corners, because you've got a bit more time to think about it. So you release the lever and you run that more speed in, you hit that barrier, and then you just tell yourself, lean the bike more. And then you just give it a tiny bit more of a push on the inside bar, the bike leans a bit more, and then you've got that new lean angle limit that you've discovered. Again, not easy, no quick fix. The revelations and the jumps will come in different ways for different people, but it's just a case of just learning about the sport and then just, again, beating at that door until you make that breakthrough. Because in my experience, everyone does at one point or another. Morning, Nathan. Good to see you in here. Right. That is the end of that very long answer. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, Manuel. He says, can you explain your throttle position when turning right on a corner so you can lean the bike properly? So this isn't really a huge deal. I've seen some people talking about this more recently, in more recent years. A lot of people talking about the screwdriver grip, which is basically, if you imagine your hand and wrist perpendicular to the bar, all you're doing is rotating it to the outside slightly, so that you're holding it like this instead of like, I can't really show it properly, like this, and a bit more like that. So basically, yeah, just rotating it round so that your elbow points out a bit more, and it just frees up the elbow. In terms of controlling the throttle and using the bar, it doesn't really change much. But for me, I just found it. So I'm 6 foot, but I've got quite long legs and long arms, and I kept getting my elbow trapped behind my knee. So I used to find myself like trying to lift my elbow to get it round, and I discovered that if I was just to rotate my wrist a bit and leave my elbow on top of my knee, it just totally freed the way for this arm to move as I moved into the corner and got into the position I needed to. So yes, in terms of bike control and leaning the bike properly, it won't make a huge difference, but just turning that wrist slightly and pointing the elbow out a bit more above the knee might just be the fix that you need if you're having problems with this. Hopefully that answered your question. If you're here and it didn't, then just let me know. Okay. We're about to jump into some long ones again now. Marche, again, hope I'm saying that name correctly. He was asking two questions. First one was about lean and heavy braking. So he says, according to Simon Crayfar's Moto Voodoo school, he recommends to move the upper body to steal a few meters on braking, start leaning the bike for a few degrees, still heavy braking, and only then release the brakes and rapidly increase lean angle at the same time, turning with a closed throttle. I do understand that it refers to really hard braking on big machines, but is it worth dragging the line on so much, especially on small capacity bikes where corner speed is important? Or are the gains not so big over trail braking? Have you tried this technique? Hello, Javier. So yes, I've tried the technique. And yes, he is talking more about big bikes. He's not really talking about anything wildly different though. If you go to any recognizable school that teaches riding to a decent level, they're all kind of saying the same things, and Simon is saying the same thing, but the way he words it can be a little bit more confusing for some people. So yeah, so first I've got to kind of clear a few things before I can get to the main point. So the first thing is trail braking. So you remember yesterday's video where I talked about building up the brakes and then slowly tapering them off or trailing them off as you get closer to the corner. That is essentially trail braking. All you're doing when you start trail braking in the traditional sense, in terms of how most people talk about it, you're still using that same braking technique. You're just moving the brakes off point deeper into the corner. So again, your actual lever action won't really change. The only difference is that where you're just tapering that last little bit off just as you start to enter, if you're trail braking to a high level, you'll be doing that much deeper into the corner. So you'll be carrying more brakes into that corner entry phase as you're starting to lean over and increase lean angle. So that's trail braking, and Simon is doing that. Simon is, if you watch his riding, he's definitely doing that. What he's referring to is more like the initial phase when you just start creeping into the corner, because you're still at very modest lean angles. Because if you imagine a bike leaning like this, there's an area of lean where you can still apply full brakes, even at part lean angles, like very slight lean angles. And that's mainly what he's referring to there. And I know he talks about releasing the brake quickly and then getting to your maximum lean angle. Again, he's still trail braking there because he's starting to trowel the brakes off as he does that. So again, he is still trail braking. So the other thing to consider, and this is where Simon's points mainly come into play, is and this is something we touched on in the previous Q&A, is about the transition point, or as Ken Hill calls it, the slowest point in the corner. So the best way to describe this is in a hairpin. So in a hairpin, and that's why, because in a hairpin it's really important to get into them and out of them quickly, and that's where you can see most clearly where the pro riders make up time. So let's just say roughly right in the middle of a hairpin, that's going to be your slowest point in the corner, or your transition point, which is the point where you stop slowing down and you get back to the throttle and you start speeding up. The speed in the middle of the corner for a pro isn't that different to a rider, even at let's just say top track day pace. Someone that's like at the top of the fastest group, of the advanced group, the speed won't be that different in the middle of the corner. Where they make up all their time is getting to that point very quickly and getting away from that point very quickly. What Simon is talking about is how to get to that point quick with regards to his braking technique, is to get to that point quickly. And again, This will be more on big bikes because you're trying to create this more V-shaped effect by doing that. You kind of start drifting a bit earlier, take a shallower entry line in, get to that transition point quickly. At that point, you're off the brakes, the bike's turning, and as soon as it's pointed, you stand it up and you fire it out. So, trail braking, transition point. So again, that's something that's seen in hairpins and with bigger bikes. That's where it's most obvious to see. On smaller bikes, you won't take it quite as seriously. You won't be drifting quite as much, but you're still going to be doing it to a degree. I think where it came from for Simon was probably seeing a lot of guys that had learnt from the California Superbike School and seeing those guys like stay way out wide and then flicking the bike over quickly and then trying to get around that way. Whereas really, again, like on modern bikes and modern tyres, just sticking with the hairpin example, going in a bit shallower on the brakes and using them in that way, in the way that Simon talks about, that's the fastest way in a corner like that. So I think that's kind of why he sort of gravitated towards that, like telling people to start drifting in early and still using heavy brakes. Okay. This is why I write the notes, just to make sure I stay on track here. I hope this is all stringing together and making sense for you and answering your question. So yeah, your question was, would you use Simon's technique? And the answer is yes, because it's the same one, and it's the one that every top level rider will use to a very high level. And yes, on smaller bikes it will vary slightly, but not a massive amount. And again, it does depend on the corner. So, like I said, hairpins, it's really obvious that they do that, but on a really fast sweeper, for instance, you might find that 1,000 and a little Moto3 bike might be a very similar line because they aren't using the brakes quite as much and they don't need to fire it out in the same way. So they'll prioritize entry speed too, the bigger bikes I mean. So in that instance, the lines won't be so different. It can be very easy to kind of fall into these like one way of doing things and trying to apply it to every situation. But I see so many riders getting stuck when they try to do that, and this is potentially one of those situations. Okay, let's before we go on to the next one, I'll just see what's going on in the comments. Gareth says, is it best to have your bum towards the back of the seat when cornering rather than up against the tank? So definitely not towards the back, and this is a problem I see. So a lot of coaches and schools, in my opinion, correctly state that you should be just a little way off the tank, just because it allows you to more easily slide sideways. But what some riders do is they take that too far and they move way back in the seat. But the problem is that means that the connection you have with the tank is not very good. Really, you want to have the like your core point, let's just say roughly in the middle of your thigh, maybe even closer to your groin than that. But when you sit right at the back of the seat, assuming you don't have a massive bump stop, when you sit right back like that, you can't have that connection. So you just put too much strain on your legs and it makes it more difficult. So a little way off the seat, but not a massive amount. You're welcome, Manuel. Tony Elias does this somewhat. He's amazing at braking straight to the apex and then getting the bike fired out. That's another really good point, is going back to what I was saying about everyone trying to do things in one particular way. It can differ from corner to corner, but even riders, you even see the differences in riders. Look at Dovizioso. He stops the bike in the corner and everyone's held up behind him, and then no one can pass him because he gets out the corner so fast with that Ducati power, setting up the line correctly so he can use that and no one can get past him. You could look at someone like Lorenzo and say, okay, corner speed, that's what we need to be doing. Look at Lorenzo, he's so fast. But then, yeah, on the other end of that scale, Dovizioso is like, it's an exaggeration, but he's stopping the bike in the middle of the corner and doing something that's noticeably different at this high level. So again, there's those nuances there. Okay. Chat Chai? Sorry if I got that wrong. Do we intentionally apply countersteering for all turns on the track? Yes. Countersteering is the only way to effectively steer a motorcycle. Your body weight moving around will have an effect, but what you do with the bars is how you steer the bike, and that's the biggest thing that's going to change the direction. So yes, you're always countersteering because it's the way that bikes work. Okay, caught up there. Let's jump back in. So we still had another one from Marche, a second question. Each corner can be driven with multiple lines. With a traditional racing line, we carry more speed on entry, but riding longer at full lean angle and corner exit drive suffers a little bit. With a wider entry line, we have less speed at the beginning, but thanks to the possibility of getting to full throttle earlier, we can exit much faster. How do you recognise the fastest line for a given corner? It also refers to the speed of steering on entry, so being able to recognise the fastest line will be much easier. It will then be much easier to decide how fast we lean the bike. So, to be honest, the fastest way to learn a line is to look at what the best riders are doing, and use others as your reference, because it would take you a very long time and a lot of laps to actually truly figure out what the best line is just on your own, and that's assuming you can ride to a really good level already. Even in MotoGP, they have guys. There was an amazing article I read, I think it was last year at the Sepang test, just before the season started, and Bradley Smith was on one of the corners with some of the journalists, and he was talking about how valuable it is to follow a faster guy, because at the time I think he'd seen someone just following around lap after lap. And he said it was so valuable to follow someone faster because you can see where they're doing things and the different approaches they're taking. You can learn from that. So here we have the very, very fastest guys in the world on two wheels, and even they don't know fully what the best lines are for each corner, and they're trying to learn from the other riders there to try and gain that tiny advantage. So it's difficult to just ride around on your own, especially if you're not that experienced and you don't fully understand the sport and all that stuff. It's difficult to just go out on your own and just find that stuff. Now, over time, you will start to pick up that stuff as you learn about the sport, and you can see how people are using the track. Like if there's a corner with a big straight on it, you realise quite quickly that, okay, it's probably going to need a late apex. But these are all just things you'll pick up along the way. But yeah, for the most part, I would just start looking at what other riders are doing. We're very lucky in the UK in that we've got high level racing at basically all the major circuits. So you can kind of see what the guys are doing there. And it's not always applicable because they are riding at such a high pace, but even the guys at like club race level and stuff like that, you can just kind of pick up from what everyone else is doing. So yeah, to be honest, the answer there is continue learning about correct track craft and all that stuff, and then just look at what the best guys are doing. It doesn't necessarily mean it will be the way to do it, but it's a very good starting point at least. Okay. Manuel, another question. On track, do you use the front brake or the rear brake most? I don't ever use the rear brake on track. There's definitely situations where you can, but I never have. I never felt like it was worth my attention to do it, and I know you can get to an extremely high level without ever touching it. And the thing I always fell back on was the fact that when Lorenzo was at Yamaha, he never used the rear brake. So that in itself was enough for me to just say, okay, I'm not going to bother using it anymore. But there definitely will be people that do. And there's tiny little instances where it can be beneficial, but I wouldn't say to waste attention on it personally. Okay. Next question from Milan. He says, what's the best way to use the brake and throttle during the turn? Is it trail braking until the apex and then open the throttle without the long pause between braking and accelerating? Or is it brake, slowly release the brake, then the engine brake until the apex and then open the throttle? Or does it depend on the specific turn? So the first thing I want to say on this is to try not to think about everything as relative to the apex, because where you perform these actions can change wildly relative to the apex depending on what corner you're going through. So you might have a really big corner that has two apexes. So you could still be trail braking past the first apex if that's what the corner demands. Or if you've got a really long corner where the apex is extremely late, you would never be able to trail the brake all the way to the apex because you'd be going far too slowly by the time you got there. You're going to be getting on the throttle well before that apex. So yeah, the first thing there is to try not to think about everything that way. If you're talking about like a basic 90-degree corner, you can, but all the corners vary so differently that it's just not the way you should be thinking about it. Okay, so the absolute best way is to have extremely little time between when you finish braking and when you get back to the throttle. Now, that's what the very, very best are doing, but that's not actually what I tell people to do, because that final bit of braking at very high lean angle is where most of the risk is, and there's very little reward. So for me, I normally tell people to just be, once they've, the first step in this is you have to master how to use the brake properly in the braking zone and learn how to trail it off with the bike mainly upright. So if you're quite new, then that's the first thing I want to see. Once you can do that with the with the brakes and the brake lever, then you can start to push those brakes a bit deeper in. But in terms of the end goal, I tell most people to aim for is to just be finishing their last bit of braking just before they're reaching maximum lean. And then, presuming you've got the entry line correctly and you're on the line you want, there shouldn't be a massive gap between when you finish braking and when you get back to the throttle. And again, actually, I think it was Ari that posted a link to Simon Crafar at Aragon, and that final corner is a perfect example in that he'll get in and he'll finish his braking and he'll be back on the throttle shortly after that, and then he's basically sitting on the throttle all the way around that, just steady building the speed, where most of the corner is basically on the throttle, but the gap between the two is quite small. So yes, so if you can, there'll never be a massive pause between the two, as in finishing braking and starting your throttle, but it's not, you always need to wait to make sure your bike is online first. So I don't want you to get into the habit of going finish brake, now throttle. You still need to be waiting to see whether if the line is correctly and it's on the line you want, then you get back to the throttle. And with time and more laps, you'll start to see, okay, I can maybe tweak this here, I can maybe drag a bit more brake in. But again, all of that comes after you've kind of really mastered just braking in general and learning to taper and trail the brakes off, mostly upright, and then you can start pushing that deeper into the corner. Just wanted to talk about in that final bit. So, and I know I did touch on it, but again, just to reiterate, trailing the brakes a lot at high lean angle, you're getting so little from that for a lot of risk. So again, just once you're really starting to reach that maximum lean angle, and I'm talking about maximum lean, not necessarily just your knee down, I'm talking like really high lean angles. Once you're starting to approach that, me personally, I want to see people just taking that final bit of braking off. Okay. Next question from Fernando. Now, I've labelled this one Fernando, but there was a ton of questions on downshifts and little variations on it. So I'll try and answer everyone's questions the best I can. Fernando said, I would like to know, when do you downshift as you approach the corner? Do you downshift, then brake, or brake, then downshift? I feel there is a lot to do in not enough space or time. How would you tackle this? So first off, the sequence. So let's take the corner in video 2. So basically, once I start braking, all I'm doing is waiting for the bike to slow down a bit so that the revs drop, and then I'll start braking. So my general rule of thumb is to get them done as quick as possible without over revving the bike. So if you get to your braking point and your bike is at maximum RPM, you don't want to immediately downshift because you're just potentially going to over rev the bike. So typically what we'll do is start slowing down, let the revs drop a bit, and then start the downshifts. So that's the sequence. And then, so it was sit up, brake, wait a bit, 1, 2, downshifts, releasing the clutch each time. Downshift as early as possible. If you don't feel like you have enough time, you're probably doing it too late. I'll be very surprised if it's because you're braking so late that you have no time. So maybe it's a case of 1, getting them done earlier, and 2, working to do them quicker. If they're really drawn out, like you're going down, then you're just with the clutch. It needs to be a lot quicker than that. So that could be a point there. Something else you can do if you have to do multiple. Now this is not really a situation I've come into much myself, but you can do multiple downshifts. So you pull the clutch lever in, then you go down 1 or 2 gears, and then you pull it out. The only danger there is that the revs can potentially drop a long way, and when you try to re-engage the clutch, you've got a massive difference in speed between the rear wheel and the engine speed, and that's when you get that. That's when it breaks traction and it starts wagging the tail around. So if you are going to do that and do 2 or 3 gears in one go, then you need to be very quick with it, which can be tricky. Now, if you watch the fastest guys, they're just stupidly quick. Admittedly, they helped a little bit because now they have downshift blippers, which is going to help. But yeah, just seeing how quickly their feet move, I just can't move it that fast. I don't know how they've managed to do that. Or Leon Haslam, he's got like a little chicken wing leg that kind of flicks out as he does it. Maybe he doesn't have the ankle mobility, I'm not sure, but they're just so fast at doing it. So yeah, if it's feeling rushed, I think the two key things there is to try and get it done earlier if you can, and then just practice trying to do it quicker and quicker while still being controlled. Okay. How are we looking? Oh. Okay, next one. Is the suspension setup mandatory for beginner track riders? My pronunciation was perfect. Excellent. I'm still hesitating on saying it though. It depends really. It depends how wrong it is. If it's got like a base setting for that bike, then I think it'll be fine to begin with. Because a lot of it as well comes with your speed. So as you progress, it's always going to be changing. Now you can continually do that, but I rode my R6. I just stole some settings from my friend, punched those in, and rode the R6 for 6 seasons like that. Took it from the top of novice to top of fast. So yeah, my experience, I just might have got really lucky there. That's a important thing I want to say. I might have just got lucky, but yeah, I don't think you need to spend a ton of money doing it. But at the very least, I think if there's any doubt in terms of how it's set up, then yes, because that in itself could be a mental thing that just makes you think, is the bike set up correctly to take me to where I want to go? So yes, it will be worth doing if you don't know the history, or yeah, you're just not confident what settings in. But in terms of the setup itself, helping your progress, it probably won't be the catalyst. But just from a mental point of view, then yeah. Okay, another one from Marche. Dan, one more came to mind. What do you think about using inside arm to stand the bike up on corner exit while opening the throttle? Some guys say not to do that due to less control. But to be honest, I feel it's helpful. But using the inside arm, yeah, that's what I use. And it makes sense to do that because you're inside the bike, so you have maximum control over this bar. And like I said before, it's the bars that change the lean angle of the bike. So you're inside, you've got most control of the inside bar. So yeah, I just pull on the inside bar when I'm ready to stand the bike up and start driving out. So yeah, that's how I do it. Rasta says, hi Dan, I'm entering the corner with the clutch fully pulled in. And when I realise the clutch... Wait, make sure I get this right. I'm entering the corner with the clutch fully pulled in, and when I realise the clutch, I lose the rear end because the RPM is around 2000. How should I downshift? Okay, so I just went over all of that. But yeah, basically, you don't want to do that. The downshifts and I've got a video on this on my channel, so just, if you want to find it, I think you've got to search for how to downshift on the track, and that's the technique that I use. But yeah, you just got to be a lot quicker with that clutch action, because if you let those revs drop when you re-engage it, especially if you're at lean angle and starting to commit to the corner, you're going to have some pretty hairy moments. Because yeah, once the engine speed starts to match the rear wheel speed and that kicks out, not a nice place to be. Okay. So have I gone up too high? Yes, I have. Okay, Fernando, here we go. Okay, Max, what do you think about the leg out Rossi style? I don't really. I know there's a lot of theories about it and reasons why people say they do it. My belief is that it's purely a rider feeling thing, and they just do it because it feels better, but no one really knows why. So for that reason, I don't really pay much attention to it, and I would never tell anyone to try and practice it. But that's all I have on that. Burger, hey, how's it going? Okay, he says, how to get a feeling for max brake pressure at a given lean. I don't think I can answer that because, I mean, I'm still there. I'm still learning what those limits are myself. I guess, yeah, again, it comes back to what I was saying before, right at the beginning, about how you push your barriers, barriers in these kind of areas is just being confident that you're doing the right things, and then just slowly pushing the bike as you can and just seeing what feedback you get. I wouldn't necessarily say it's easy to sit there and say, okay, I know I can do this much pressure at this lean angle, without going there first and seeing what the bike does. Okay. Hopefully that helps. Burger. Chris, will a GP shifter mitigate that? To be honest, I find it more difficult with a GP shift to downshift quickly. Overall, I prefer GP shift, but in downshifts in particular, when you're doing lots, it was a lot easier to go down, down, down on the lever as opposed to trying to flick your toes up to do the downshifts. So in that respect, I actually think that road shift is easier for that, but overall, I prefer GP shift, and I think it's better. Okay, let's move on to our doc. Shaheen, similar question regarding downshifting and engine braking as we approach corners, especially after a long straight and lots of speed to scrub off and 2 or 3 gears to downshift. I've experienced that once I'm on the brakes and the load is on the front end, downshifting can cause the rear to unload and lock up, making the bike unstable as I turn in. Also, downshifting after scrubbing off most of your speed means downshifting much closer to the turn marker, a time when you want to be focused on turning the bike and hitting your apex. I basically already hit that before. I thought there was a slight variation, but I must have just, got a bit blended there. But yeah, basically the same advice really is try and get them done earlier. And while if you're trying to be, so I don't know if your bike has a slipper clutch or anything like that, but that could, if you don't have one of those, that could be a reason why, because you're maybe rushing them a little bit, and it's just causing it quite abrupt when the engine speed tries to match the rear wheel speed. If you do that too quickly, then that's when you're going to get more of that snaking, and you might even get a really bad juddering through the bike as it tries to match up. But you can be quick and still be smooth and mitigate that issue. But it just takes some practice of trying to be as quick as you can while still being smooth. And if you feel like you're doing that right in the corner, then it's just going to be a case of trying to push that further away from the corner and getting them done as soon as possible without over-revving the engine. Berger says, I tried the knee dangle like Rossi whilst hard braking and backing it in. It feels easier to control and needs less force to keep myself from sliding forward. That's really interesting. That's something I've never tried. Again, from like a fundamentals point of view, it's not something I would tell a learning rider to go and do for obvious reasons. But again, there's proof that it just creates a good feeling. There's probably a few different real scientific reasons as to why it works like that, but I've just never really gone into it or tried to. But even on your 300, that was still you found it good to do that backing in. That's impressive. Chris, how do you feel about backing it in once someone is at the more advanced pace? Again, I have to go back to my old mate Lorenzo and just look at his tidy riding style. That's always the style that I try and replicate, because I think it's the most easiest style to achieve for the average rider. Doing stuff like backing it in and all the stuff that Marquez does, and that's just raw talent, and it's just not something you can really teach necessarily, or it's certainly a lot harder to teach. And you don't need to do that to go extremely quickly for like your average rider. So backing it in is not something I would personally recommend people do. Any tips from Greg? Any tips for improving line consistency? I have a lot of fun on the track, but I'm far from consistent, which makes improving difficult. I also have a mental barrier from using the extreme edges of the track. So a lot of consistency comes from knowing how to control the bike. So steering, again, this is stuff we talked about in video 2. Knowing how to control the bike and being able to put it where you want, and then having your vision as well as the brakes and throttle, which will also affect the points on the track that you hit, and then using your eyes correctly to actually see the space in good time so you can put the bike where you want to. So it's a combination of things, but vision is probably the key thing there. Mental barrier when using the extreme edges. I have that same thing. what I was told to do and worked for me was on the sighting laps when you go at a slow pace, just even if you don't feel like you need to, just go and ride the edges of the track. Just get a feel for being close and just using that space, and realize that you're not going to suddenly crash when you're near them. So that's one thing. But to be honest, also, a lot of that confidence will come as you ride more and you get confident of where the bike goes when you perform each action. So there's corners that I've ridden thousands of times now that I know exactly where I'm going to end up, because I've just have that experience of where I want to be, and I know where I want to be and what I want to do with the controls. And when I do those things, I end up in the exact same place. So yeah, a lot of that too will just come from confidence of, just experience of riding more and just learning these things and riding the track more. Because again, from the apex, I can tell you like within inches, like where I'm going to end up on the outside curb, for instance. Douglas says, clamp-ons, do you mean clip-ons? Clip-ons that have the offset further forward. What's the reason for this? And what advantage or disadvantage is there to feel and drivability? So I have mine as basically as far forward as I can. Again, I'm assuming you're talking about the clip-ons. I have mine as far forward as I can, without restricting the steering rack too much against the fairings. For me, because I'm just a taller guy, it just gives me more space when I'm leaning off, and also just more leverage on the bars because they're wider, so they're just gives me that more leverage. So yeah, for me, I just prefer them further out. I know that Dovizioso does that exact same thing. He has you see that some of the Ducati bikes are just crazy wide with how far they stick them out, just because it gives extra leverage. And when you're probably a lot of that is to do with like the aero stuff they have now, where the bikes are harder to turn. But yeah, that's how I do it. Chat chart, how much do you move the inside knee into the corner? Most of the MotoGP guys do not put it out so much. What's the principle for this? The reason why they don't put it out much is because they don't need to, because they're at 60 odd degrees of lean angle and they just have to do that and they touch down. To be honest, there's no set rule to this. The only thing I try to tell people to avoid, because I've seen a few people doing it, is trying to go too wide. So I can't get that wide, but some people have insane hip mobility and they can almost stick their knee out perpendicular to the bike. But the problem there is that it starts to hinder your lean angle, because it either one gets in the way or it gives you the false perception that you're leaning really far, but because your knee's so far out, then you won't. So I don't stick my knee out very much at all. So for me, I know that as soon as my knee touches down, my foot and therefore my peg is only a short way behind it, and that's just my reference. That'll be different for different people. Some will stick it out a long way, and then as they lean more, it collapses. But yeah, no set rule. It's just what feels right for you. Just being wary not to stick out too far that it restricts your lean angle. Yeah, Bo, I'm not gonna lie, I was referencing you a little bit there, but I have seen other people do it too, so don't feel too bad. Right, we have some more questions on the dock. Another one on downshifting. Raynan, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly again. Downshifting left versus right. Yeah, there was a couple of questions about how to downshift when going left, how to downshift when going right. It's no different. Yes, it will be more awkward, but it shouldn't feel impossible. So if you're, so like we said in video 2 yesterday, you're going to position yourself to the correct side of the bike before you get into the corner and before you start braking if you can. So yes, there's going to be times when your foot isn't in the same position, relative to, either side. So yes, it will feel different when you're trying to get under that lever if you have GP shift, or on top of it, it's probably not quite as hard. So yes, it can feel more awkward, but it shouldn't feel impossible. And if it does, then you may need to tweak the position. So it depends how much adjustability you have, but you should definitely be able to move it up and down. And if you can move it closer or further away from the peg. So that might be something to look at. Yeah, just tweak your setup if you don't feel like you can do that. yeah, so Bo says scraping my knee in many corners and still getting blown away on track. So it means that because he had his knees so far out, he had his knee down, but he was still getting blown away. I was the opposite of that. So it took me a long, long time to get my knee down. Again, because I don't stick it out very far. Which, yeah, I wasn't just trying to overstretch it. But there'd be people that I'd look at, and I still hadn't got it down yet. There'd be people I'd look at and think, those guys have got it down, but I'm literally going around the outside of them. How is this working? And it's literally just because I wasn't sticking it out far enough at the time. Or one of the reasons was anyway. Right. One more on downshifting from Lee. He's asking about downshift timing, which we already talked about. Asking about front brake without the rear brake. Again, like I said before, I don't use the rear brake myself. And using the brakes and downshifting on a wet track. So riding technique doesn't really change when you get on a wet track. The ceiling of grip just gets lower. So you have to be a lot more mindful of your actions. So on a dry track with really sticky rubber, you can get away with some things if you're really harsh with your controls. And it's those kinds of things you need to minimize. So you don't want to have any massive spikes in force that's going through the bike and through the tires based on what you're doing with the brakes, the steering and the throttle. So in terms of like the downshifts, it's just being sure just to do it really smooth. Again, you're going to have less grip at the rear. So if you're really snatchy with it, or you rush it, or you let the revs drop too much because you've got the clutch in for too long, you're going to just come into more problems because there's less grip. So again, the technique doesn't really change. You're just looking to try and do it as smooth as possible. Right, that is all we have. Again, I know these comments are a little bit behind, so if you do have anything else, I will wait for a bit longer. Hopefully you guys took a lot away from the video today. I know there's a lot to it, a lot to the sequence, but just learning these pieces and doing it step by step, you can just slowly start to put those things in place. Tomorrow we're going to get into like the full roadmap of what to expect. That's my dog. Can you hear my dog? Great timing. The full roadmap of what to expect and kind of where you might sit. So basically, depending on where you sit along this roadmap that I'm going to show you, it will depend on what you work on and what level you work on these different things. So that's what we're going to go into tomorrow. It doesn't look like we have any more questions, so I think I'll wrap it up there. Okay, so yeah, video 3 is going to be going out tomorrow. We're going to look at that. Definitely be there for that. Again, not talking about some of the more sexy things that we talked about in video 2, but it is going to give you a ton of direction and make you realize what you should be focusing on now. And I'm going to give you a worksheet that actually details the milestones that you should be looking to hit first, which is going to get you along the path to high-level riding more safely. Okay, looks like we're all done. Yeah, so that video goes out tomorrow, and we're going to have one more Q&A on Saturday at the same time. I mean, that Q&A will just be answering anything you've got. So, yeah, if you've still got more questions after this, then we can tackle them then. Okay, have a great rest of your day, everyone, and I will talk to you very soon.